March 15, 2019, Studio 6 Billions at TBS. Frank Devlin had survived 32 years without anyone asking the right question. Tommy Brennan was about to ask it. The cameras were rolling live, 6 million viewers watching. Frank sat across from Tommy, sweat already beading on his forehead, knowing this interview was supposed to be a corporate puff piece about network programming. Then Tommy leaned forward with that trademark grin. "Frank, before we talk business, I've got to ask. I heard you used to do stand-up back in Chicago. Ever think about getting back on stage?" Frank's mouth went dry. His hands started shaking. In the control room, producers noticed something was wrong. What happened in the next 12 minutes became the most watched late-night moment in television history. Entertainment lawyers held emergency meetings, and for years afterward, when people talked about live TV disasters, they always came back to this night. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank's tongue felt like sandpaper against his teeth. The studio lights burned hotter than he remembered from his comedy days. Or maybe it was the cold sweat breaking across his scalp that made everything feel amplified. Tommy's question hung in the air between them like a loaded gun. "Stand up?" Frank managed, his voice catching slightly. He could hear it, that microscopic crack that 20 years of boardroom presentations had trained him to eliminate. That was a long time ago, Tommy. But Tommy Brennan hadn't become America's favorite late-night host by letting interesting moments slip away. His eyes lit up with the predatory gleam that made celebrities simultaneously love and fear appearing on his show. "Come on, Frank." Our researchers dug up some old Chicago Tribune archives. "You were Frank the Fuse Devlin, right? Played the laugh track, Second City. Pretty impressive circuit back in the day." The nickname hit Frank like a physical blow. Nobody had called him that since 1987. Since the night that carved out everything good inside him and left him hollow. In the control room, he could see movement through the glass. His assistant Janet was probably wondering why the network's senior vice president of programming looked like he was about to vomit on live television. "The Fuse," Frank repeated weakly, buying time. His hands were trembling now, and he pressed them flat against his thighs under the desk. "Haven't heard that in—" "Must have been some wild times," Tommy interrupted, leaning forward conspiratorially. "I bet you've got stories that would make our censors break into a cold sweat. What made you give it all up for the corporate world?" Frank's vision tunneled. 32 years of careful reconstruction, of building Frank Devlin the executive from the ashes of Frank the Fuse Devlin the comedian. And it was all cracking apart under studio lights hot enough to melt flesh. He could smell something burning. Probably his career, his marriage, his entire carefully curated existence. The audience was loving this. He could hear their anticipation, that familiar electric hum of people sensing they were witnessing something unscripted and dangerous. It was the same energy he used to feed off during his sets, back when he could make rooms full of strangers explode with laughter instead of making himself explode with panic. "Well," Frank said, his voice steadier than he felt, "you know how it is. Life happens. Priorities change." Tommy's grin widened. "But you were good, right? I mean, you don't just walk away from something you love unless—" He paused dramatically, a skill that had served him well through countless celebrity interviews. "Unless something happens. Something that changes everything." The studio went dead quiet. Even the cameramen seemed to sense they were witnessing something extraordinary. Frank could feel 6 million invisible eyes pressing against him through the television screens, waiting for his answer. His throat felt like it was closing. In that moment, Frank realized with crystalline clarity that Tommy Brennan knew something. This wasn't casual banter or routine research. This was targeted, surgical, the kind of precision that came from having specific information and knowing exactly how to deploy it. "Nothing dramatic," Frank lied, the words tasting like copper in his mouth. "Just grew up, I guess. Started wanting more stability." "Stability," Tommy repeated, savoring the word. "That's interesting. Because I've got to say, Frank, for a guy who wanted stability, you're looking pretty unstable right now." The audience laughed, not the warm, inclusive laughter Frank remembered from his performing days, but something sharper, more predatory. They could smell blood in the water, too. Frank's shirt was soaked through now. He could feel sweat running down his spine, pooling at the small of his back. His carefully pressed Armani suit, the armor of his executive identity, was betraying him, turning dark under the arms despite the industrial air conditioning. "Tommy," he said, trying to inject some authority into his voice, "I think we should probably talk about the network's fall lineup. That's why I'm here, after all." But Tommy Brennan was a shark who had caught the scent of something bigger than a promotional interview. His producers were probably going insane in the control room, torn between cutting to commercial and letting this train wreck continue. Good television was often indistinguishable from watching someone's life collapse in real time. "Oh, we'll get to that," Tommy said, his tone light but his eyes laser-focused. "But first, I'm curious about your last show. Chicago, 1987, The Laugh Track. Do you remember that night, Frank?" Frank's heart stopped. Actually stopped, skipping beats like a broken record. Because Tommy Brennan had just proven he knew about the night that killed Frank Devlin the comedian and created Frank Devlin the corporate executive. The night someone died laughing at Frank's joke. The world tilted sideways. Frank's peripheral vision blurred as the studio audience became a sea of faceless shapes, their expectant murmur fading to white noise. Tommy's question echoed in his skull. "Chicago, 1987, The Laugh Track. Do you remember that night, Frank?" Each word a hammer blow against the fortress he'd spent 35 years building around that memory. Of course he remembered. Every comedian remembered their last set. But Frank's last set hadn't ended with applause or even crickets. It had ended with sirens. Harold Zimmerman, 63 years old, front row center, clutching his chest while the rest of the audience laughed at what they thought was part of the show. Frank could still see Harold's face, the confusion first, then the fear, then nothing at all as his eyes rolled back and his body slumped forward. The paramedic said it was massive cardiac arrest. Instantaneous. The stress, the laughter, the perfect storm of biological timing. What they didn't know, what nobody knew except Frank, was that Harold hadn't just been laughing, he'd been heckling. Vicious, personal attacks about Frank's appearance, his material, his worth as a human being. And Frank, riding high on adrenaline and crowd energy, had decided to destroy him with the cruelest punchline of his career, the joke that literally killed. "Frank?" Tommy's voice cut through the fog. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Frank blinked back to the present. His mouth was so dry he could barely swallow. In the control booth, he could see Janet leaning forward, her normally composed face creased with concern. Sweet Janet, who'd been his assistant for 8 years, who remembered his coffee order and his daughter Emma's birthday, and never asked why he kept a bottle of Tums in every desk drawer. Emma. Christ, Emma would be watching this. She was probably in her dorm room at Northwestern right now, maybe with her roommates, proudly telling them how her dad was going to be on TV. His little girl who thought her father was some boring corporate suit who'd always worked in television, who had no idea that Daddy used to make people laugh for a living until he made someone die for entertainment. "I'm fine," Frank said automatically, the corporate response trained into his nervous system. Always fine, never rattled, never vulnerable, just, "The lights are pretty intense." Tommy's smile was predatory now, a great white sensing wounded prey. "The lights, sure. But you know what I find interesting, Frank? We called around, did a little digging for this interview. The Laugh Track closed permanently in December 1987. Just shuttered overnight. No explanation. And your last performance there." Tommy paused, consulting his notes with theatrical precision. "November 15th, 1987. After that, Frank the Fuse Devlin vanished completely. No more bookings, no farewell tour, nothing." Frank's hands were trembling now, and he couldn't make them stop. He pressed his palms harder against his thighs, feeling the expensive fabric of his trousers grow damp. This was a nightmare. This had to be a nightmare. In 35 years, he'd never faced a single question about that night. He'd moved to Los Angeles 3 weeks after Harold Zimmerman's funeral, changed his entire life, buried the comedian so deep that sometimes even Frank forgot he'd ever existed. "People change careers all the time," Frank managed, his voice barely above a whisper. The microphone clipped to his lapel amplified every breath, every slight tremor. 6 million people could probably hear his heart hammering against his ribs. course they do, Tommy agreed. But usually there's a transition, a gradual shift. You went from headlining comedy clubs to working in the mailroom at a talent agency literally overnight. That's not a career change, Frank. That's running away. The studio audience was dead silent now. Even they could sense something seismic happening, something beyond the usual late-night banter. Frank could feel their collective attention like a physical weight, pressing down on his chest until he could barely breathe. In the front row, a man about Harold Zimmerman's age leaned forward slightly, interested. Frank's vision began to tunnel again. The man had Harold's silver hair, Harold's thick-rimmed glasses. For one terrifying moment, Frank thought Harold had come back to finish what they'd started 35 years ago. "Tommy," Frank said, his voice cracking completely now, "please, I just came here to talk about our fall programming." But Tommy Brennan had already drawn blood, and they both knew there was no going back now. The interview had become something else entirely, an execution disguised as entertainment. "Oh, we'll get to that," Tommy said, his tone almost gentle, almost kind. "But first, I really want to know about Harold Zimmerman." Frank's world exploded into white noise. The name hit Frank's nervous system like an electric shock. Harold Zimmerman. Spoken aloud on live television after 35 years of silence, the syllables felt like a curse being lifted and a death sentence being pronounced simultaneously. Frank's vision blurred completely. The studio audience disappeared. Tommy's face became a smear of artificial tan and predatory teeth. The only thing that existed, in Frank's universe, was that name, bouncing around his skull like a ricocheting bullet. Harold Zimmerman, Harold Zimmerman, Harold Zimmerman. How did Tommy know? How could Tommy possibly know? I don't, Frank started, but his voice had abandoned him entirely. His throat felt like someone had packed it with sand. In the control booth, Janet was standing now, her hand pressed against the glass, her mouth moving frantically as she spoke into her headset. Emergency mode, damage control, but there was no controlling this damage. It was already spreading through 6 million homes like wildfire. Tommy leaned back in his chair, savoring the moment with the casual cruelty of a cat playing with a dying mouse. "Harold Zimmerman," he repeated, slower this time, each syllable precisely enunciated. 63 years old, retired accountant from Evanston, loved comedy, used to drive into the city every Friday night to catch shows at the Laugh Track. Frank's hands were shaking so violently now that he had to grip the arms of his chair to keep them steady. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Harold Zimmerman had died alone in Cook County Hospital 3 hours after Frank's set. No family in the audience that night, no friends, just a bitter old man who'd come to the club to drink away his loneliness and had ended up drinking away his life instead. "Tommy," Frank whispered, his voice barely audible even through the sensitive microphone. "Please stop." But Tommy Brennan had found his rhythm now, the deadly cadence that had made him the most feared interviewer in late-night television. "Harold had a heart attack in your audience, didn't he, Frank? Right there in the front row. November 15th, 1987. During your set." The studio air conditioning couldn't compete with the heat radiating from Frank's body. Sweat was pouring down his face now, staining his collar, turning his expensive suit into a soggy mess. He could taste salt and panic, and 35 years of suppressed guilt all mixing together on his tongue. "That's," Frank's voice cracked like a teenager's. "That's not, how do I know?" Tommy's grin widened. "Well, Frank, that's where it gets really interesting, because someone was there that night. Someone who's been carrying this story for over 3 decades, waiting for the right moment to tell it." The world stopped spinning. Frank's heart actually stopped beating for one terrifying moment before lurching back to life with painful irregularity. Someone was there. Someone saw. Someone knew. "You see," Tommy continued, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper that somehow felt more menacing than shouting, "My producer got a call last week from a woman named Margaret Zimmerman, Harold's daughter." Frank's soul left his body. Margaret. Harold's daughter who lived in Portland, who'd been estranged from her father for years, who hadn't even known he was dead until the hospital called her 3 days later. Frank remembered that detail from the brief obituary he'd obsessively read and reread in the Tribune's back pages. No mention of how Harold died, no mention of the laugh track. Just a small paragraph about a lonely man's unremarkable end. "Margaret's been doing some genealogy research," Tommy explained, his voice taking on the measured cadence of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "Going through her father's old papers, trying to understand who he was after all these years. And she found something interesting, a ticket stub from the laugh track, November 15th, 1987, and a journal entry her father wrote that same day. Frank couldn't breathe. The studio lights were pressing down on him like a physical force, driving him deeper into his chair. He could hear his pulse in his ears, a thundering rhythm that seemed to echo through the microphone and into millions of living rooms across America. "Would you like to know what Harold wrote, Frank?" Tommy asked, pulling a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "About you? About that night?" Frank opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. His carefully constructed life, the executive, the father, the respectable man, was crumbling in real time, and there was nothing he could do but sit there and watch it happen. Tommy Brennan had orchestrated this perfectly, turning what should have been a routine promotional interview into Frank's personal apocalypse. Frank realized with crystalline terror that he was about to hear Harold Zimmerman's voice again for the first time in 35 years. And this time, Harold was going to have the last laugh. The folded paper in Tommy's hand looked impossibly small for something that contained the power to destroy an entire life. Frank stared at it, transfixed, as if it were a loaded gun pointed directly at his chest. The studio had fallen into a silence so complete that he could hear the mechanical hum of the cameras, the whisper of the air conditioning, his own ragged breathing amplified through the microphone. "No," Frank said suddenly, the word erupting from somewhere deep in his chest. "No, I don't want to know." He started to stand, his legs trembling beneath him like a newborn colt's. This was insane. He was the senior vice president of programming at TBS. He didn't have to sit here and be ambushed on live television. He had lawyers, he had contracts, he had 35 years of respectability that couldn't just evaporate because some dead man's daughter had found an old journal. "Frank." Tommy's voice was soft but carried the weight of absolute authority. "Sit down." And Frank did. Not because he wanted to, but because his body obeyed without consulting his brain. The executive who commanded boardrooms full of Hollywood power brokers had become a puppet, and Tommy Brennan was pulling the strings. In the control booth, Frank could see chaos erupting. Janet was gesticulating wildly at someone off camera. Producers were huddled around monitors, their faces grim. One of them, Mike, the kid with the Harvard MBA who always wore ties that were too narrow, was pointing at Frank and making slashing motions across his throat. Cut to commercial. End this. Save what could still be saved. But the cameras kept rolling. "The journal entry is dated November 15th, 1987, Tommy continued, unfolding the paper with deliberate slowness. "Harold wrote it that afternoon before he went to the laugh track. He was having a difficult time, recent divorce, early retirement that wasn't quite as golden as he'd hoped. Drinking a little too much." Frank's vision began to fracture at the edges. He could see multiple Tommies, multiple audiences, multiple realities all colliding in his peripheral vision. In one reality, he was still Frank Devlin the executive, fielding softball questions about fall programming. In another, he was Frank the Fuse Devlin, 23 years old and invincible, making a room full of strangers explode with laughter. And in the third most terrible reality, he was watching Harold Zimmerman die all over again. "Harold wrote about feeling invisible," Tommy said, his voice taking on an oddly gentle cadence, "about how nobody really saw him anymore. His wife was gone. His daughter hadn't spoken to him in months. He was just existing." Frank's throat constricted. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Harold was supposed to remain the faceless heckler, the anonymous drunk who'd gotten what he deserved. He wasn't supposed to have a story, a life, a daughter who missed him enough to dig through his papers 35 years later. "But Harold loved comedy," Tommy continued. "It was the one thing that still brought him joy. He wrote about how much he was looking forward to the show that night, how he hoped the comedian would be funny enough to help him forget his troubles for a few hours." "Stop." The word came out as barely a whisper, but Frank could see Tommy heard it, could see the momentary flicker of something. sympathy, regret, crossed the host's face before the predatory gleam returned. He wrote about you specifically, Frank. He'd seen you perform twice before. He thought you were brilliant. He wrote that you reminded him of his younger self, angry, but channeling it into something beautiful instead of destructive. Frank's hands were gripping the chair arms so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The studio lights were pulsing now, synchronized with his heartbeat, turning the world into a strobing nightmare. Harold had been a fan. Harold had come to see him specifically. Harold had died laughing at a joke Frank had crafted specifically to humiliate him, to destroy him, to make him suffer for daring to interrupt the show. In the audience, the man who looked like Harold was leaning forward even further, his eyes locked on Frank's face. Behind him, Frank could see other faces. Older faces, faces that could have been anyone who'd ever sat in a comedy club front row and trusted a comedian to entertain them instead of annihilate them. The last line of the entry, Tommy said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, forcing the entire studio to strain to hear him, says this: "Maybe tonight will be the night I laugh hard enough to forget everything that hurts." Frank began to weep, not the dignified tears of a corporate executive maintaining composure under pressure, but the ugly, choking sobs of a broken man who'd been carrying a corpse on his back for 35 years. His carefully constructed mask, the suit, the title, the respectability, cracked completely, revealing the terrified comedian underneath who'd never gotten over his last performance. "Frank," Tommy said gently, "what happened to Harold that night?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Frank's sobs had reduced to ragged gasps, his chest heaving as 35 years of buried guilt clawed its way to the surface. The studio lights felt like interrogation lamps now, white-hot and merciless, exposing every crack in his facade. "What happened to Harold?" Frank repeated, his voice barely recognizable. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, smearing tears across his cheek. "What happened was that I killed him." The audience intake of breath was audible, a collective gasp that rippled through the studio like a shockwave. Tommy's eyes widened slightly. Perhaps he hadn't expected such a direct confession, but he quickly recovered his composure. "You killed him?" Tommy pressed, leaning forward. "Frank, Harold died of a heart attack. The medical examiner didn't know what I did to him that night." Frank's voice was gaining strength now, fed by decades of suppressed confession. Harold wasn't just some innocent fan sitting quietly in the audience. He was drunk, belligerent. He'd been heckling me from the moment I stepped on stage. Frank could see it all again with terrible clarity. The laugh track's cramped stage, cigarette smoke thick as fog. Harold Zimmerman in the front row with his loosened tie and bloodshot eyes. The way Harold's voice had cut through Frank's carefully crafted rhythm like a rusty knife. "He kept interrupting my set," Frank continued, his hands trembling as he spoke, "calling me a hack, a pretty boy, said I didn't know real pain, said I was just another privileged kid playing dress-up in a comedy club." Tommy glanced at his notes, then back at Frank. "So you responded to a heckler. That's just part of stand-up, isn't it?" Frank laughed, a bitter, broken sound that made several audience members visibly flinch. "Responding to a heckler, yes. What I did was something else entirely. I researched him." The words felt like confessing to murder. In a way, Frank supposed he was. "During my first break between sets, I cornered the bartender, asked about the drunk in the front row. Turned out Harold was a regular. Came in every Friday, got plastered, told anyone who'd listen about his problems. Messy divorce. Daughter who wouldn't speak to him. Lost his job 6 months earlier for drinking. The bartender knew everything." Frank could see Janet in the control booth, her face pale with horror. This wasn't damage control anymore. This was witnessing a public suicide. "So when I went back on stage for my closing set," Frank continued, his voice growing steadier with each terrible word, "I had ammunition. Real, personal, devastating ammunition. And when Harold opened his mouth to heckle me again, I destroyed him." The studio had fallen into a silence so profound that Frank could hear his own heartbeat echoing through the microphone. 6 million people were listening to a man confess to the worst thing he'd ever done. I told him his wife left him because he was pathetic. I said his daughter was probably relieved she didn't have to pretend to love him anymore. I made jokes about his drinking, his loneliness, his complete failure as a human being. Frank's voice cracked again. The crowd was eating it up. They thought it was brilliant. A comedian so quick-witted, he could improvise a complete character assassination. Tommy's predatory smile had vanished, replaced by something Frank couldn't quite identify. Fascination? Disgust? Professional admiration for the sheer audacity of the confession? But Harold wasn't laughing, Frank whispered. Harold was just staring at me, and I could see in his eyes that every word was true. Every joke was hitting exactly where I intended. I was surgically dismantling a broken man in front of a room full of strangers, and they were applauding me for it. Frank remembered the moment with crystal clarity. Harold's face going from anger to hurt to something deeper, a recognition that he was being seen, truly seen, for the first time in months, and that what was being seen was deemed worthy only of mockery. Then I delivered my final line, Frank said, his voice barely audible now. I looked right at Harold and said, "Sir, you're laughing so hard because you finally found someone more pathetic than yourself. Me for wasting 5 minutes on someone whose death wouldn't even rate an obituary." The studio audience was completely silent now. Frank could hear someone in the back rows crying softly. Harold started laughing then, Frank continued. Not the good kind of laughter, the kind that sounds like screaming, and he just kept laughing, harder and harder until he couldn't breathe, until his face turned purple, until he grabbed his chest and fell forward and didn't get back up. Frank looked directly into camera too, knowing Emma was watching somewhere. I didn't just tell a joke that night. I weaponized Harold Zimmerman's pain against him, and when he died laughing, I ran. I never even stayed to see if he was okay. The silence stretched for what felt like eternity before Tommy finally spoke, his voice unusually quiet. "Frank," he said, and there was something different in his tone now, not the predatory glee from moments before, but something almost gentle. "There's something you need to know about that night." Frank looked up, confusion cutting through his emotional devastation. Tommy was reaching into his jacket again, pulling out another piece of paper. This one looked newer, crisper than Harold's journal entry. "Margaret Zimmerman didn't just send us her father's journal," Tommy continued. "She also sent the medical examiner's report, the full report, the one that was never made public." Frank's blood turned to ice water. "What are you talking about?" Tommy unfolded the paper slowly, and Frank could see it was an official document. Letterhead, stamps, the bureaucratic formatting of death. Harold Zimmerman didn't die of laughter-induced cardiac arrest, Frank. He died of a massive coronary brought on by acute alcohol poisoning and a previously undiagnosed heart condition. The words hit Frank like physical blows. He stared at Tommy, his mouth moving soundlessly as his brain struggled to process what he was hearing. "The timing of his heart attack during your set was coincidental," Tommy continued, his voice clinical now. "According to the medical examiner, Harold had been dying all evening. The combination of alcohol and his damaged heart meant he could have collapsed at any moment, walking to the bathroom, ordering another drink, or just sitting quietly in his chair." Frank felt the ground shifting beneath him, 35 years of carefully constructed guilt suddenly becoming quicksand. No, that's not. I saw what happened. I saw him laughing. You saw a man having a heart attack," Tommy interrupted. "The involuntary muscle spasms, the gasping for air, it can look like hysterical laughter to someone who doesn't know what they're seeing, especially someone who's convinced they're responsible." Frank's vision blurred as the studio seemed to tilt around him. Everything he'd believed about that night, everything he'd built his penance upon, was crumbling like a house of cards. The executive career he'd pursued as punishment, the comedy he'd abandoned as penance, the relationship with Emma he'd sabotaged out of guilt, all of it based on a lie he'd told himself. "But the things I said to him," Frank whispered, "the way I destroyed him in front of everyone, were cruel," Tommy agreed. "Unnecessarily cruel." "But Frank, Harold was already dying before you ever opened your mouth. You didn't kill Harold Zimmerman. You just made his last few minutes more unpleasant than they needed to be." The revelation was somehow more devastating than the guilt had been. Frank had spent 35 years defining himself by his monstrosity, finding a perverse comfort in believing himself capable of literally killing with words. It had made him feel powerful even in his self-loathing. But this reduced him to exactly what he'd always feared being: ordinary, fallible, human. "Margaret wanted you to know," Tommy said, his voice softer now than Frank had ever heard it. "She said her father would have wanted you to know." Harold understood comedy, Frank. He understood the relationship between performer and audience. He wouldn't have wanted anyone to carry this kind of guilt over his death. Frank looked out at the audience, and the man who'd reminded him of Harold was gone. In his place sat a different person entirely, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who was nodding at him with something that looked like forgiveness. "Why?" Frank asked, his voice raw. "Why do this on television? Why not just tell me privately?" For the first time since the interview began, Tommy's confident facade cracked slightly. He glanced down at his cards, then back at Frank. And in that moment, Frank saw something he hadn't expected: shame. "Because I'm an arrogant son of a bitch who thought it would make better television," Tommy admitted. "Because I convinced myself that public confession was somehow more meaningful than private redemption. Because I wanted to be the guy who broke the big story, even if breaking it meant breaking you." The honesty was startling in its simplicity. Tommy Brennan, the king of late-night television, had just confessed to calculated cruelty on his own show. The predator had revealed himself to be just another flawed human being, wielding his platform like a weapon because he could. Frank stared at Tommy for a long moment, then did something that surprised them both. He started to laugh. Not the broken, hysterical laughter he'd mistaken Harold's death throes for, but genuine, cleansing laughter that bubbled up from somewhere deep in his chest. 35 years of unnecessary guilt were evaporating in real time, and the relief was so overwhelming it had to escape somehow. "Jesus Christ, Tommy," Frank gasped between laughs. "We're both horrible people." Tommy's laugh joined his, hesitant at first, then building into something that bordered on hysteria. The studio audience watched in stunned silence as two men who'd spent the last 20 minutes psychologically dismantling each other suddenly found themselves bonding over their mutual awfulness. "The absolute worst," Tommy agreed, wiping his eyes. "I just publicly tortured a man to boost my ratings, and you've been carrying around guilt for a murder you didn't commit for 35 years. We're like a really depressing buddy comedy." Frank's laughter began to subside, leaving behind something he hadn't felt in decades: clarity. The weight that had been pressing down on his chest since 1987 was gone, but in its place was a different kind of pressure, the weight of possibility, of choices that suddenly mattered again. "The real question now," Frank said, his voice steadier than it had been all evening, "is what the hell I do with the rest of my life." Tommy leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since the interview began, he looked genuinely curious rather than predatory. "What do you mean?" Frank gestured around the studio, at the cameras, the audience, the chaos in the control booth where Janet was probably drafting his resignation letter. "I built an entire career on running away from comedy. I became the suit, the executive, the guy who manages funny people instead of being one. I convinced myself it was penance, but really it was just cowardice." The admission hung between them like a challenge. Frank could see Tommy processing this shift, recognizing that his ambush had inadvertently become something else entirely, a reckoning not just with the past, but with the future. "You could go back," Tommy said quietly. "To comedy, I mean. 58 isn't exactly retirement age." Frank considered this, really considered it for the first time in decades. The idea should have terrified him, the thought of stepping back onto a stage, of making himself vulnerable to an audience's judgment. But instead, he felt something he'd almost forgotten: excitement. "The comedy world has changed a lot since 1987, Frank mused. Social media, cancel culture, everyone recording everything. A dinosaur like me might not survive 5 minutes up there. Or," Tommy countered, "you might bring something those young comedians don't have: experience, pain, the kind of hard-earned perspective that only comes from spectacularly fucking up your life." In the audience, Frank noticed something shifting. The tension that had gripped the room during his confession was transforming into something else: anticipation. They weren't watching an execution anymore, they were watching a resurrection. The woman with kind eyes was smiling now, and others around her were leaning forward with genuine interest. Frank turned to camera 2, knowing millions were watching, but for the first time thinking about Emma specifically. She was out there somewhere, probably in shock, definitely angry, possibly proud. He'd always been so terrified of disappointing her that he'd never given her the chance to see who he really was. Not the suit, not the penance, but the man who'd loved her enough to push her away rather than drag her down into his guilt. "Emma," he said directly to the camera, "if you're watching, and I know you are because you never miss my public humiliations, I owe you an explanation. Not just about tonight, but about everything. About why I couldn't commit, why I always held back, why I chose the safe path instead of the one that led to you." Tommy had gone completely quiet, recognizing that something real was happening in his studio. This wasn't television anymore. It was confession, absolution, and transformation, all happening in real time. "I spent 35 years believing I was a killer," Frank continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "And killers don't deserve love or happiness or second chances. But if Tommy's right, if I'm just a coward who's been hiding behind his guilt, then maybe it's time to stop hiding." The control booth had gone still. Janet was no longer gesticulating wildly. Instead, she was staring at the monitors with something approaching awe. Even Mike, with his two narrow ties, had stopped making throat-slashing gestures. Frank turned back to Tommy, who was watching him with frank admiration. "You know what the funny thing is? This whole ambush, this public execution you planned, it's the first honest conversation I've had in decades." Tommy nodded slowly. "Sometimes it takes a really public breakdown to have a private breakthrough." "So what happens now?" Frank asked. "Do I slink off stage in disgrace, issue a public apology, resign in shame and disappear into obscurity?" Tommy glanced at his cards, the careful script he'd planned for this interview, then deliberately set them aside. Whatever happened next would be uncharted territory for both of them. "I have a better idea," Tommy said, and something dangerous sparked in his eyes. "How about you tell us a joke?" The words hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Tell us a joke. After 35 years, after everything that had just been revealed, Tommy was asking him to step back into the arena that had defined and destroyed him. Frank felt his mouth go dry. The studio audience shifted in their seats, sensing they were about to witness something unprecedented, a man confronting his deepest fear on live television. The cameras seemed to lean in closer, hungry for whatever would happen next. "A joke," Frank repeated, his voice barely steady. He looked out at the audience, and for a moment he was 23 again, standing on the laugh track's cramped stage with cigarette smoke thick as fog and Harold Zimmerman in the front row. But this time, the faces looking back at him weren't hostile. They were expectant, hopeful even. "I haven't told a joke in 35 years, Tommy. I'm not sure I remember how." "It's like riding a bicycle," Tommy said, but his voice was gentler now, stripped of its earlier predatory edge. "Some things you don't forget, even when you want to." Frank stood up slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. The studio lights seemed impossibly bright, exposing every line on his face, every tremor in his hands. In the control booth, he could see Janet frozen at her station, her mouth slightly open. The technical crew had stopped their bustling entirely. Even the cameramen were staring. "You know what's funny?" Frank began, and his voice caught on the word funny. He cleared his throat and tried again. "What's funny is that I spent 15 years climbing the corporate ladder, becoming everything I used to make fun of. I went from mocking suits to becoming the most expensive suit in the building." A few tentative chuckles rippled through the audience. Frank felt something dormant stirring in his chest. The old instinct for timing, for reading a room, for finding the rhythm between setup and punchline. "I became so corporate that I started having meetings about meetings. I once spent 2 hours in a conference room discussing whether we needed a committee to form a committee. And the worst part? I took notes. The laughter was building now, and Frank could feel the old muscle memory returning. Not just the mechanics of comedy, but the deeper thing, the connection between performer and audience, the shared recognition of absurdity that made pain bearable. But tonight, sitting here with Tommy, who, let's be honest, makes Satan look like a guidance counselor, I realized something. I've been running from the wrong thing all these years. The audience was fully engaged now, their earlier discomfort transformed into genuine delight. Frank caught Tommy's eye and saw something unexpected there, not triumph, but relief. as if Tommy himself needed this transformation as much as Frank did. I thought I was running from comedy because I was afraid of hurting people. Turns out I was really running from myself because I was afraid of being hurt. Which, when you think about it, is like refusing to drive a car because you're afraid of getting a parking ticket. The laughter came easily now, washing over Frank like absolution. He looked directly into camera too, thinking of Emma watching somewhere in the city, and his voice grew softer but somehow more confident. I spent 3 decades convinced I was a monster. Turns out I was just an asshole, which is actually tremendous news because assholes can change. Monsters are stuck being monsters forever. Tommy was grinning now, the first genuine smile Frank had seen from him all evening. And what does an asshole do when he figures out he's been an asshole? Frank paused, feeling the weight of the moment. 6 million people were watching. His colleagues were watching. Emma was watching. The man he'd been for 35 years was dying on live television, and the man he might become was taking his first breath. Well, Frank said, first he apologizes to the people he hurt while he was busy being an asshole. Then he figures out what he actually wants to do with the rest of his life, instead of what he thinks he deserves. He turned back to the audience, and the woman with kind eyes was wiping her cheek. But she was smiling. And maybe, Frank continued, his voice growing stronger, if he's really lucky, he gets a second chance to be the person he was supposed to be all along. Before he got so scared of failing that he forgot how to try. The applause started slowly. A few people clapping, then more, until the entire studio was on its feet. But it wasn't the polite applause of a television audience. It was something raw, more personal. The sound of people recognizing their own struggles reflected back at them. Tommy stood too, extending his hand. When Frank took it, Tommy pulled him closer and said, quietly enough that only Frank could hear, "Welcome back." Frank squeezed his hand and whispered back, "Thanks for the push off the cliff." As the applause continued, Frank looked out at the faces in the audience and realized he wasn't afraid anymore. The truth had been told, the secret had been exposed, and he was still standing. For the first time in 35 years, Frank Devlin was ready to find out what came next. The applause faded gradually, like thunder rolling away after a storm. Frank remained standing beside Tommy's desk as the studio lights dimmed and the audience began filing out, their voices carrying a subdued buzz of people who'd witnessed something they hadn't expected. Several audience members caught Frank's eye as they passed. Nods of acknowledgement, tentative smiles, the woman with kind eyes who mouthed thank you before disappearing through the exit. Tommy was already being swarmed by production assistants with clipboards and urgent whispers, but he broke away long enough to grip Frank's shoulder. "My office, tomorrow morning. We need to talk about what happens next." Frank nodded, though he wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring. For the first time in decades, the uncertainty didn't terrify him. The green room felt different when he returned to collect his jacket. The mirror that had shown him a frightened executive an hour ago now reflected someone else entirely, older, more weathered, but somehow more present. Frank straightened his tie from habit, then laughed and loosened it instead. Some changes could start immediately. His phone had been vibrating constantly since walking off stage. 17 missed calls, 43 text messages, and an inbox that was multiplying like a virus. Frank scrolled through them, colleagues expressing shock, reporters requesting interviews, a lawyer offering his services, and buried near the bottom, a single text from Emma. "Watch the show. Call me when you're ready to tell the truth about us too." Frank stared at the message for a long moment, then slipped the phone into his pocket without responding. Some conversations deserved more than text. The TBS building at midnight was a monument to corporate ambition, all glass and steel reaching toward a sky that couldn't see past the city's glow. Frank's corner office on the 15th floor felt smaller than it had that morning, the awards and framed photographs seeming to belong to someone else. He packed methodically, personal items in one box, files he'd need to transition in another. The resignation letter he'd drafted years ago but never sent sat in his desk drawer, yellowed with age. He left it there. Some gestures required fresh words. By 2 a.m., Frank found himself walking through Lincoln Park, past the zoo where he and Emma had spent Sunday mornings in the early days, before he'd convinced himself he didn't deserve Sunday mornings with her. The city was quiet except for the distant hum of late-night traffic and the occasional siren. Chicago looked different in the small hours, more honest somehow, stripped of its daytime pretenses. His apartment felt hollow when he finally returned. 15 years of careful neutrality suddenly obvious. Beige walls, safe furniture, nothing that revealed too much about the man who lived there. Frank poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon and sat in his leather chair, the most expensive piece of furniture he owned and the most uncomfortable. The local news was running clips from the show. Frank watched himself confess on television, struck by how different it looked from this side of the screen. The man talking wasn't the monster he'd believed himself to be, or the executive he'd forced himself to become. He was just Frank, flawed, frightened, but finally, utterly human. His landline rang at 6 a.m. Margaret Zimmerman's voice was soft but clear despite the early hour and the decades between them. "Mr. Devlin, I wanted to call before the reporters found me. I hope you understand why I sent that information to Mr. Brennan. Dad always said comedy was about truth, even when truth was ugly." Frank listened to her talk about Harold, his love of stand-up comedy, his struggles with alcohol, his belief that laughter could redeem almost anything. Margaret had been 16 when her father died, but she remembered the stories he'd told about the laugh track, the dreams he'd had of maybe trying comedy himself someday. "He would have been proud of you last night," she said before hanging up, "for finally telling your truth." The morning news brought fresh chaos. Frank's phone rang constantly. Reporters, old colleagues, Comedy Central expressing interest in something, anything he might want to do. He unplugged the phone and made coffee, standing at his kitchen window, watching Chicago wake up. At noon, he walked into Tommy's office without an appointment. Tommy was alone, still in yesterday's shirt, surrounded by newspapers and printouts of social media responses. 6 million people watched, Tommy said without looking up. "Highest ratings we've had all year. They're calling it appointment television." Frank settled into the chair across from Tommy's desk, the same chair where this had all begun yesterday. It felt like a different life. "I'm done with television," Frank said quietly. "At least the executive side. I called Janet this morning and tendered my resignation." Tommy finally looked up, and Frank saw exhaustion in his eyes. "What will you do?" Frank smiled, and it felt like the first genuine smile he'd worn in years. "I'm 58 years old, Tommy. I'm going to find out who I am when I'm not afraid." Outside Tommy's office, Chicago stretched toward the horizon, full of stages and microphones and second chances. Frank walked toward them, finally ready to discover what came after the truth.